In this video, I'm going to briefly talk about the right and left in politics. You will often hear people talk about a political spectrum where there's a left and a right, and it can be sometimes confusing to figure out what people are actually talking about. Now, I should note that right and left aren't buckets. There is a tendency in political debate to talk about the right or the left as if they are a unified entity that can fit in a bucket that encompasses everybody. And that's really not the case. What about the middle? There's a lot of middle in politics, and especially in North American politics, a lot of voters do fall somewhere in between the extremes of right and left. Wouldn't fit necessarily into a bucket. So what we do is we use a political spectrum to try and compare right and left. Now, a spectrum is better because it can illustrate relationship if something is further right than another, and also the direction if some parties over time are trending in one direction or another. So a political spectrum is often what we use to try and place individuals or parties on a spectrum from right to left. Now, we can use a spectrum for anything. Color. We have a color spectrum to try and understand the relationship of different colors. Some spectrums aren't overly useful. We could arrange beer on a spectrum from dark to light. But that doesn't really tell us anything. It doesn't tell us anything about flavor or bitterness or type of beer, whether it's a lager or an ale. And so by choosing this sort of bidirectional spectrum, it's easy to try and categorize things, but it's incomplete. It doesn't really give us a full picture. And that also applies to the political spectrum. It is easy to try and place things on a right to left spectrum. In crude terms, what we mean is that the left wing, the left side of the spectrum, would be the radical side of the spectrum or the revolutionary side of the spectrum. They want to change something. They want to overturn the system and to do something new, or to reform the existing institutions. On the right, we call it the reactionary side. They are reacting against that movement. And so within that, we can plot different worldviews and try and compare them to one another. But is this really that helpful? If we look at something like communism and fascism, they are both totalitarian ideologies that want a strong state that tells everybody what to do. So in that dimension, they do have something in common. However, economically speaking, they are very different. And so a right-left spectrum doesn't really capture all of that. Which is why in political science, there's another dimension that is added to help try and categorize different either individuals or parties or worldviews. On one axis will be attitudes about the government. Do you want a government that is very aggressive and that tells people what to do and that has a lot of power? Or at the bottom, do you want a government that allows for more individual freedom and lets people do whatever they want? Or do you want some mix of that and you fall somewhere in the middle? From left to right, we put attitudes about the organization of the economy or society. Do you want a society that is more equal in terms of their outcomes, or do you want one that's more individualistic and allows for some inequality? So we call that sort of loosely the collectivism versus individualism side of the spectrum. And you'll see some different nomenclature around in different textbooks, but the principles remain the same. How much power do you want the government to have? How do you want society to be organized on the other axis? So within that, we could probably do a better job of placing things like communism and fascism, who would both be near the top. However, they would be near the extreme. So it captures elements that some of them have in common and really sort of hashes out the true differences. Just to recap, right and left, these are general directional attitudes. They are not buckets. We can loosely refer to the left side as the radical side and the right side as the reactionary side. However, there's a lot of different dimensions within there. And the two key ones are the role of government. How much authority do you want the government to have? And also the distribution of resources and the organization of society. Do you want things to be more equal, or do you want to allow for some individuality and some inequality?